Hey, what's up everyone? How's it going? This is Watch, and in this video we're doing a full head-to-head comparison between the all-new 12-inch MacBook with the Retina display versus the 2015 version of the 13-inch MacBook Air. So if you're interested in seeing how these two MacBooks compare against each other in terms of the display, the internal performance, and a whole bunch of other things, this is a perfect video for you. So without any further ado, let's get right into this head-to-head comparison. Now, in terms of the design and physical dimensions, funny enough, the 12-inch MacBook is quite a bit more compact than the 13-inch MacBook Air, both when it comes to the overall size and footprint, as you can see over here. But even in terms of the thickness, the 12-inch only measures about 3.5 millimeters to about 13.1 millimeters at its thickest point, versus the MacBook Air is certainly quite a bit thicker at 17 millimeters at its thickest point. And in terms of weight, the 12-inch only measures about 920 grams versus the Air measures about 1.35 kilograms. So there's almost a pound difference between the two, and you can certainly feel that weight difference when you're holding both computers in your hand. Now, in terms of the design and overall build materials, you're looking at a very similar products. Now, even though the new 12-inch is completely redesigned, it still feels like a MacBook. It still looks like a MacBook. In fact, it looks much more similar to a MacBook Air than a MacBook Pro, and because of its wedge shaped, it certainly has that aesthetic as well. So you could definitely consider this to be the next generation MacBook Air, although I'm sure the next generation 13-inch edition will have a very similar design, because this new 12-inch design will probably be the next design theme that we're going to carry out throughout the different lineups of MacBook computers. Now, moving forward, let's talk about the ports and connectivity options we have on both computers. Now, one thing that the 13-inch MacBook Air has the 12-inch beat is certainly the connectivity options. We have a full-size MagSafe 2 connection for charging the laptop, 2 USB 3 ports, 1 Thunderbolt, a 2-port which can transfer data up to 20 gigabits per second, dual microphones, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and a full-size SD card slot. By contrast, the 12-inch is completely barren. It only has one port, and that's the USB Type-C connection. And this one port serves as multiple different functions. You use it to charge up your computer. It has a USB 3.0 connectivity, as well as a whole bunch of different video interfaces such as DisplayPort 1.2, HDMI, VGA. You can also connect a whole bunch of different accessories that will come out later in the future for USB Type-C. But the big downside is immediately you're going to have to get different adapters. So if you have a USB thumb drive and want to hook things up, you're going to need an adapter for that. If you have like a different camera or something like that, you're going to have to hook up to that. So you can see the trend. Pretty much every accessory you're going to have, you're going to need an adapter. A huge pain in the head to deal with when you're first getting this computer, and certainly a large drawback for early adopters. Now, that being said, USB Type-C is the future of connectivity. There's really no doubt about it. And even though a lot of people are going to complain when they're first getting this computer, in the future, pretty much everything will be USB Type-C enabled. So later on, that won't be a problem, but you're going to have to deal with some compromises in the present moment. Now, in terms of the webcams, we have 720p FaceTime camera on the MacBook Air versus a 480p FaceTime camera on the 12-inch MacBook. Now, even though they're very similar in terms of color rendition and low light performance, that added resolution is nice to have, and certainly a missing feature on the new 12-inch. Now, let's move on to one of the major differences between the two, and that's the new keyboard on the 12-inch MacBook. Now, this is a complete redesign of the keyboard, but you have the same key configuration. Basically, you have 78 keys US and about 79 keys in the international models on both notebooks in terms of the core layout. Now, there is a difference in terms of the design and mechanics of both of these keyboards. The new 12-inch MacBook has a completely redesigned keyboard. One of the reasons why Apple has made the 12-inch even thinner than the Air is specifically because of the keyboard. So inside each key on the MacBook Air, we have a scissor mechanism switch, which is a lot thicker in terms of its profile compared to the butterfly mechanism we have on the new 12-inch. Now, essentially what this does is lower the profile of the keys themselves. You do have less key travel as a result of that, and coupled with this stainless steel dome switch, the new keyboard is supposedly a little bit more accurate and stable when typing on, especially if you strike the edge of the keys, compared to the previous generation keyboard that we've seen on the MacBook Air and indeed the MacBook Pro. Now, in reality, I'm not a big fan of low profile keyboards, and this is probably one of the lowest profile keyboards I've ever experienced. It does take a little bit of time to get used to. I honestly prefer the older keyboard. Now, it's something that, again, I'll probably have to use for a little while to get a better feel for it, but immediately I'm used to typing on larger profile keyboards, and I think think having a little bit more recoil and more key travel definitely gives you a little bit more feedback into what you're doing, and making a keyboard this thin can be problematic for people that are used to a certain type of keyboard configuration. Now, of course, I would recommend everybody out there that's interested in this 12-inch MacBook to go out and check it out in real life, type on it, see how you like it compared to the previous generation MacBook keyboards. For me personally, I'm not the best judge of a keyboard because I can barely type myself. Now, some of the things I liked about the new keyboard is the larger keycap size. So the keyboard itself is physically larger than the previous generation MacBooks. Additionally, both keyboards are backlit, but we have a brand new backlight system on the new computer. They're individually LED backlit, so much better light distribution on the entire keyboard compared to the more global illumination system that we had on the previous generation MacBook Air and Pros. Continuing forward now, another addition on the new 12-inch is the Force Touch trackpad. Now, we've seen this on the MacBook Pro before, so it isn't new. What is interesting is when you start comparing the clickable mechanical trackpad that we have on the MacBook Air compared to the Force Touch trackpad, and when you close your eyes and click on both of these, you really can't tell the difference between the fake haptic feedback clicking system and the real mechanical system that we have on the Air. So that's definitely very impressive to see. This is the best example of a real haptic feedback, really delivering a convincing sensation that you are clicking down on something, even though the Force Touch trackpad has no moving parts. There's a couple electromagnetic motors that conveys both the sound and sensation of something being clicked on. Furthermore, since the entire trackpad is one large button, you can click on any region of the trackpad and get the same sensation, versus the trackpad on the MacBook Air is really only clickable in certain regions away from the hinge that's located at the top of the trackpad. Additionally, since the trackpad is force sensitive, you could enable different commands. So if you press a little bit harder, you can enable the force click function, which will allow you to do a whole bunch of different things, such as fast forward or rewind a video on the QuickTime player. You can use it to look up definitions on Safari, add contacts, and a whole bunch of other things. The only problem is that highlighting text and different objects becomes a little bit tricky, but it's something that you can get used to after a while. Now let's move on and talk about the displays that comes in these two computers. Now, in terms of the actual resolution, we're looking at a pretty big difference over here. Now, even though we have the larger display size on the Air, it only measures about 1440 by 900 in terms of its actual resolution. It is an LED backlit panel, but it is a TN panel, so the viewing angles are not great, and in terms of PPI count, you're looking about 127 PPI, versus the 12-inch MacBook has a brilliant Retina display that is LED backlit, but it also has IPS technology, so the viewing angles are quite fantastic. And in terms of its resolution, you're looking at 2304 by 1440 with a PPI count of about 226. So both in terms of pixel density and overall image quality, the 12-inch certainly has the superior display, and there's really no comparison between the two. Now, internally, we're using fairly different architecture in terms of our CPU configuration. Now, we have the baseline version of the 2015 MacBook Air, which comes with an Intel Core i5 dual-core chip clocking about 1.6 GHz. We have 3 megabytes of level 3 cache and 4 gigabytes of RAM. And in terms of graphics, we're using obviously the integrated Intel Iris 6000 series graphics. Now, the new 12-inch MacBook is using completely new architecture. We're using the Intel Core M generation of processors. We have a dual-core chip clocking about 1.1 gigahertz, and it can turbo up to 2.4 gigahertz. We have 4 megabytes of a level 3 cache. Now, you can upgrade this CPU up to a 1.3 gigahertz that can turbo up to 2.9 gigahertz if you want. But if you're going to stick with the baseline version, this is what we're going to compare in terms of our performance test. Now, the nice thing is, whichever model you get, you do get 8 gigabytes of RAM, which is nice to see. And in terms of graphics, we have Intel HD 5300 series of graphics. Now, keep in mind that even though technically the 12-inch doesn't have many things going for it compared to the MacBook Air, you still have to understand that there are no fans in the computer, so it's completely silent in terms of its operation, and it's passively cooled. And from my experience, it doesn't get too hot, even if you're pushing the computer to its maximum limit. Now, let's go ahead and actually take a look at the real-world performance differences between the two, do some benchmarking, and see which one is the faster computer. Now, the first thing that we're going to do is just do a simple boot up test. So we have both computers off right now. I'm going to press the power button on both of them at the same time, and we're just going to see which one boots up faster. Now, as you just witnessed, the 13-inch MacBook Air definitely performed a little bit better here, booting up a couple of seconds ahead of the 12-inch MacBook. Now next, we're going to specifically do a benchmark to test out our CPU performance. The first thing that we're going to do is take a look at the Geekbench 3 results, so we're just going to run it at the same time. And here are the results over here. We could definitely see that the Air is faster, both in terms of single core and multi-core processing, scoring just under 3,000 points in terms of single core and about 5,800 points in terms of the multi-core processing, versus the 12-inch is quite a bit slower at 2,400 points and 4,600 points for its single core and multi-core processing respectively. Now moving on, let's actually do another CPU benchmark, and we're going to use Cinebench R15 this time, and just going to speed up the results. And here are our final scores: about 259 points on the Air and about 207 points on the 12-inch MacBook. And you're seeing a trend over here where pretty much the Air in every scenario is going to be faster, especially if you're going to use a CPU intensive applications such as video editing and photo editing. But in terms of the web browsing capabilities, we're going to use Peacekeeper, which is going to test out our HTML5 capabilities as well as JavaScript performance, and really determine which is the faster web browsing machine. And fast forwarding to the results over here, we can see again the MacBook Air is getting a higher score. In most cases, looks like the Air is going to be the slightly faster machine when it comes to the web browsing performance. Although I do have to admit that based on my personal web browsing tests, I really had no serious issues with the 12-inch. I think for most people, it's a very capable machine, especially for most people's web browsing needs. Now moving on, let's talk about the internal flash memory we have on both of these two computers. Now in terms of capacity, when you get the 12-inch, it basically comes with 256 gigabytes versus the baseline configuration of the 13-inch comes with 128 gigabytes. Now to evaluate the read and write performance of these two computers, we're just going to pull up our good old-fashioned Blackmagic speed test and see how they compare. And as you can see, we're getting much higher throughput on the MacBook Air of over 1.3 gigabytes per second in terms of read speed, at about 630 megabytes per second in terms of write on average. By contrast, the 12-inch MacBook is quite a bit slower at around 750, 760 in terms of read, and just over 450 megabytes per second in terms of its write capabilities. So I would think that they'd be using a very similar flash-based memory system, but I guess that's really not the case. We find a pretty big difference between the two when it comes to transferring data back and forth. And funny enough, the read and write performance actually matches last generation MacBook Air read and write performance, so it wouldn't surprise me if they're actually saving a little bit of money on their flash memory modules and actually using the older generation systems. So that's a good way to make a little bit of money. It's kind of upsetting. I wish it was as fast as the new generation MacBook Air and MacBook Pros. Now, the last thing that we're going to test out is the graphical performance of these two computers, and to do that, we're going to use Unigen's Heaven benchmark. We're going to set the resolution to 1280 by 800, medium detail settings, no anti-aliasing, and here are the results over here. We're getting about 19.4 frames per second on the MacBook Air versus about 12.7 frames per second on the 12-inch. Now, keep in mind that the integrated Intel graphics on the 12-inch is certainly no match for the Intel 6000 series graphics we have on the Air. But if you do lower down the resolution on the 12-inch, you can get playable frame rates depending on what kind of game you're playing. And certainly, as you can see over here, Minecraft is no problem at 720p. Now, last but not least, we're going to talk about the battery performance out of these two. Now, in terms of the battery capacity, you're looking at 54 watt-hour battery on the Air and about a 39.7 watt-hour battery on the 12-inch MacBook. Now, in terms of their actual performance difference, the Air is still the king of the hill when it comes to battery performance. You're getting way over 12 hours. In fact, in some of my tests, I get over 13 hours of web browsing and things like that, especially if you keep the screen brightness kind of low. Now, the 12-inch MacBook, based on my independent tests, got around 8 hours, 45 minutes on average after a couple of days of usage. Now, keep in mind that I did watch a couple of hours of videos. I did a little bit of editing on ScreenFlow, so I used the CPU a little bit more than somebody should if they wanted to get a true endurance test. And I'm sure if you do a lot of light applications, such as writing a report or reading some articles online and keeping your online video to a minimum, you can definitely get over 10 hours of usage on the 12-inch. But again, keep in mind that the MacBook Air is still top dog when it comes to battery performance. And if you want the ultimate computer that will last you a very long time, certainly no problem getting throughout the day, no matter what you're doing, the MacBook Air is still one of the best computers out there for that. But really, other than that, guys, that's really it. Make sure to leave a comment down below letting me know on which computer you guys think has the most to offer. Certainly, I think the MacBook Air is a really great computer, especially when it comes to the battery life. And as you saw from the performance differences, it's faster than the 12-inch as well. Now, a lot of people will ask, what the heck is the point of the 12-inch if it's not as fast as the Air, doesn't have as good battery life, and the only thing that it has going for it is the better display, the new keyboard, and the new trackpad. And that's really it. It's a brand new design, and eventually we'll have a new refresh of the Air that will probably employ many of the design philosophies we're seeing on the new 12-inch. But really, at this point, if you want a new computer, the 12-inch is great, but if you want to save a little bit of money and get the most for your dollar, I really think the Air is probably one of the best ultrabook computers you can get. But really, other than that, that's really it. Make sure to give us a thumbs up if you like this video, and check out our other comparisons on the new 12-inch. I actually did one comparing it against the MacBook Pro, the latest version of the Retina edition. So definitely check that video out if you haven't already. But really, other than that, that's really it. Take care.